Imagine a world where you're speaking Spanish right now, where London is a Catholic city, where the British Empire never existed, and where the Americas from Alaska to Argentina speak the same language. Sound impossible? It almost happened. Welcome back to What If History. Today we're exploring one of the most consequential naval battles ever fought. The year is 1588. The Spanish Armada, the most powerful fleet ever assembled, is sailing toward England. Its mission: invade, conquer, and return England to Catholicism. In our timeline, the Armada failed. But what if it had succeeded? One storm, one tactical decision. That's all that separated our world from a Spanish-dominated globe. Let's explore what could have been. In the late 16th century, Spain was the undisputed superpower of the world. King Philip II ruled an empire on which the sun never set. Spanish conquistadors had conquered the Aztecs and Incas. Spanish galleons brought gold and silver from the New World. The Spanish tercios were the most feared infantry in Europe. England, by contrast, was a second-rate power. Queen Elizabeth I ruled a small, relatively poor island nation. But England had done something that infuriated Catholic Spain. It had broken with Rome and become Protestant. Even worse, English privateers like Sir Francis Drake were attacking Spanish treasure ships and raiding Spanish colonies. Philip decided enough was enough. In 1588, he assembled the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. 130 ships carrying 30,000 men. The plan was elegant. Sail up the English Channel, pick up an additional 30,000 Spanish soldiers waiting in the Netherlands, then invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. The Armada set sail in July 1588. What happened next became legend. English ships, smaller but more maneuverable, harassed the Armada as it sailed up the Channel. At Gravelines, a major naval battle erupted. Then storms scattered the Spanish fleet. Forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return home, more than half the ships were lost to weather and wreck. It was a catastrophic defeat. England celebrated a miraculous deliverance. The failure of the Armada marked the beginning of Spanish decline and the rise of English naval power. It paved the way for the British Empire and English global dominance. But what if the weather had been different? What if Spanish tactics had been better? What if the Armada had succeeded? Let's imagine that in our alternate timeline, just a few things go differently. First, the Spanish fleet includes more long-range cannons, similar to the English ships. Spanish naval doctrine emphasized boarding and hand-to-hand combat, but in this timeline, they've learned from earlier encounters and adapted their tactics. Second, the weather cooperates. The storms that devastated the Armada in our timeline don't materialize. The winds are favorable for Spain. Third, the Duke of Parma, commanding the Spanish army in the Netherlands, successfully coordinates with the Armada. In our timeline, communication failures prevented this rendezvous, but here it works perfectly. The result? In August 1588, a combined Spanish force of 60,000 soldiers lands on the English coast near Dover. The English army, outnumbered and outmatched, falls back toward London. Spanish tercios, the most professional soldiers in Europe, advance steadily. Queen Elizabeth attempts to rally her forces, but the Spanish military machine is overwhelming. By September, Spanish forces are besieging London. Elizabeth faces a choice: fight to the death or negotiate. Being pragmatic, she chooses negotiation. The Treaty of London is signed in October 1588. Elizabeth agrees to restore Catholicism, accept Spanish oversight of English foreign policy, and pay massive reparations. In exchange, she keeps her throne, at least nominally. But this is just the beginning. The real question is, how does Spanish victory over England reshape the entire world? Short term, England under Spanish dominance, 1588-1620. In the immediate aftermath, England undergoes a forced re-Catholicization. Protestant clergy are expelled or convert. Catholic rituals return to English churches. It's a traumatic reversal for a country that had been Protestant for 30 years. Spanish advisors flood London. English foreign policy becomes an extension of Spanish interests. English ships can no longer raid Spanish colonies. Instead, England becomes a junior partner in the Spanish Empire. The most significant impact is on North America. In our timeline, England established colonies in Virginia starting in 1607, then at Plymouth in 1620. These became the foundation of the United States. But in our alternate timeline, with England under Spanish control, these colonies never happen. Instead, Spain consolidates its control over all of North America. Spanish settlements expand from Florida up the Atlantic coast. The region we know as the United States becomes Nueva Inglaterra, New England, but it's a Spanish territory, not an English one. The indigenous peoples of North America face Spanish colonization decades earlier than in our timeline. Spanish missions, presidios, and encomiendas spread rapidly. The Native American population, already vulnerable to European diseases, faces an even more aggressive colonization. Without English colonies, there's no Massachusetts Bay Colony, no Pennsylvania, no Virginia. The political ideas that led to American independence, democracy, and individual liberty don't take root in North America. Instead, Spanish colonial culture dominates, hierarchical, Catholic, and authoritarian. Medium term, a Spanish century, 1620–1700. By the mid-17th century, the world looks radically different. Spain, already powerful, becomes even more dominant with England neutralized. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Europe from 1618 to 1648 in our timeline, goes very differently. Without English support for Protestant powers, the Catholic Habsburgs achieve a more complete victory. Germany remains divided and largely Catholic. Protestantism survives only in Scandinavia and isolated pockets. The Dutch struggle for independence from Spain becomes even more difficult without English support. The Dutch Republic might still emerge, but weaker and smaller. Dutch naval power, which rivaled England's in our timeline, never fully develops. France remains the main rival to Spanish power. But without England to balance Spain, France is more cautious. The 17th century wars between France and Spain are less intense. Europe settles into a relatively stable duopoly, Spain and France as co-dominants, with everyone else in their shadows. Economically, Spanish control of both Atlantic trade routes, through Spain itself and through England, creates an even more lucrative flow of silver from the Americas. But Spain makes the same mistake as in our timeline. It doesn't invest this wealth in productive industry. Instead, the silver flows through to purchase goods from France, Germany, and Italy. Spain becomes rich, but not economically developed. Culturally, this is the true golden age of Spain. Spanish becomes even more dominant as a language of culture and diplomacy. Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and Calderón de la Barca become not just Spanish writers, but European-wide cultural icons. Spanish art, architecture, and literature set the standard for the continent. In the Americas, Spanish control is total. From Alaska to Argentina, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Spanish is the dominant language. The entire hemisphere develops along similar lines: Catholic, hierarchical, mercantilist. Regional variations exist, but the fundamental culture is unified. Long-term, no British Empire, no American Revolution, 1700–1900. This is where the implications become truly profound. First, there's no British Empire. England remains a medium-sized European power under Spanish influence. It doesn't colonize Australia, New Zealand, or much of Africa and Asia. These regions either remain independent longer or are colonized by other powers, France, Spain, or the Netherlands. Without British naval supremacy, the Industrial Revolution either doesn't happen or happens very differently. In our timeline, British control of trade routes, access to raw materials, and large markets created the conditions for industrialization. Here, those conditions don't exist in the same way. Spain, as the dominant power, could potentially industrialize first. But Spanish economic culture is less conducive to capitalism and innovation. More likely, industrialization begins in France or the German states, perhaps 50 years later than in our timeline. Second, there's no United States of America, at least not as we know it. The Spanish colonies in North America eventually seek independence, just as Spanish colonies in South America did in our timeline. But this happens later, in the 1820s or 1830s rather than 1776. When independence comes, it produces not one United States, but several Spanish-speaking republics. Perhaps a Republic of Nueva Inglaterra in the northeast, a Republic of Florida in the southeast, a Republic of Louisiana in the center, and a Republic of California in the west. These states are culturally Spanish, politically influenced by Catholic social teaching, and economically more mercantilist than capitalist. They don't become the democratic, capitalist powerhouse that the United States became. Instead, they resemble the mixed record of Latin American countries, some prosperous, some struggling, all dealing with the legacy of Spanish colonialism. Third, democracy develops more slowly. In our timeline, British parliamentary traditions and American revolutionary ideals spread democratic governance globally. Here, without those examples, monarchy and authoritarianism remain more entrenched. The 19th century sees revolutions, but they're more violent and less successful. The African slave trade continues longer. British abolition in 1807, which pressured other nations to end slavery, doesn't happen. Slavery persists in the Americas well into the late 19th century, perhaps even into the early 20th century. So what would today's world look like if the Spanish Armada had conquered England? First, and most obviously, Spanish would be the global language, not English. Business, science, aviation, international diplomacy, all conducted in Spanish. If you wanted to succeed globally, you'd need to speak Spanish, not English. This video would be called ¿Qué pasaría si? And you'd be watching it in Spanish. The Americas would be culturally unified from north to south. The United States-Canada cultural divide wouldn't exist. Instead, you'd have a continuum of Spanish-speaking nations with variations but fundamental similarities. North America would culturally resemble Latin America. Democracy would be less widespread. Without the Anglo-American tradition of parliamentary government and individual rights, authoritarian government would be more common and more accepted. The world might have fewer democracies and more autocracies. Economically, global capitalism would be less developed. The British-American model of free markets, property rights, and limited government wouldn't dominate. Instead, you'd see more state-controlled economies, more mercantilism, more corporatism influenced by Catholic social teaching. Technology would be perhaps 20 to 30 years behind our timeline. Without the Industrial Revolution starting in Britain, without American innovation in the 20th century, global technological development would be slower. We might be living in something resembling the world of 1995 rather than 2026. The British Commonwealth wouldn't exist. Australia and New Zealand might be French colonies that gained independence, or they might have remained independent indigenous nations much longer. India might never have been unified under a single colonial power, remaining instead a patchwork of independent states. World War I and World War II might not have happened, at least not in the forms we know. Without British-German rivalry, without American power to tip the balance, European conflicts would have played out very differently. But different wars with different horrors might have occurred instead. Pop culture would be completely different. Hollywood wouldn't exist. Instead, the global film industry might be centered in Madrid or Mexico City. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Anglo-American rock music wouldn't exist. Spanish-language music would dominate globally. What if the Spanish Armada had defeated England? The answer is staggering. Nearly everything about our modern world would be different. The language we speak, the political systems we live under, the economic structures we participate in, the culture we consume, all of it stems from England's survival and subsequent rise to global dominance. One naval battle in 1588, one fortunate storm for England, one tactical failure for Spain. That's all that separated our world from a Spanish-speaking, Catholic-dominated globe where democracy is rarer, capitalism is weaker, and the entire cultural landscape is transformed. It's a reminder that history turns on small moments. The weather on a particular day, the decision of one commander, the courage or cowardice of one group of sailors. These tiny factors can reshape civilizations. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, would a Spanish-dominated world have been better or worse? What aspects of our modern world do you think would be better if Spain had won? What would be worse? Thank you for watching. Join me next time as we explore another moment when history balanced on a knife's edge. Until then, remember, the world we live in was never inevitable. It was made by people, by decisions, and by luck.